Hey guys, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another video. I recently did a video and I called it Is Rock Dead? Where I talked about the past, present, and future of rock. Basically, where rock was, where it is, and where I think it's likely to go in the future. And I thought I would do a very similar video for rock's biggest subgenre or splinter group, whatever you want to call it, and of course my personal favorite type of music. And of course I am talking about heavy metal. Now I will link the rock video in the description of this one just in case you want to check it out. In the rock video, I mentioned that rock, had its real start in the 1950s and exploded in popularity in the 1960s. Metal kind of went through the same thing. In the 1970s, it kind of had its, genesis with with the early acts. You had Black Sabbath, of course, the most important metal band really ever since they were the first. Secondly, Judas Priest, incredibly important band, and thirdly, Motorhead. I would say I would easily say those are by far the three most important bands that got their start in the 1970s in heavy metal, bar none. Those are the three biggest ones. They really laid the groundwork for everything else that was to follow in this genre. So, the 80s roll around and we have a huge explosion. We have the new wave of British heavy metal. You get Venom, Angel Witch, of course, Iron Maiden, huh? Yeah, ginormous band that everybody knows. Tons and tons of other bands from the new wave of British heavy metal that started out in the early 80s, which of course in turn inspired all of the the big American thrash acts: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax, Testament, Overkill, Death Angel, tons and tons and tons of others. Tons of British bands too, German bands. Power metal started then. Blind Guardian, Halloween, death metal, of course, with Possessed and Death, Morbid Angel, of course, popularized death metal. I mean, this was all, metal was just exploding in the 80s. It was actual, absolute, and of course, it hit its commercial peak in the 80s as well. Of course, most of what was commercially successful was just hair metal, which it's debatable if that's really metal or not. That's something that we could certainly talk about. Does it actually qualify as metal, or is it just like hard pop rock? I mean, that's definitely something worth discussing, but I'm not gonna really cover that in this. And metal is just absolutely gigantic in the 80s. And then, of course, the 90s came along and grunge came along, and grunge absolutely destroyed hair metal, right? I mean, it killed hair metal dead. And honestly, I don't think that was a huge loss. I mean, metal very much carried on in the underground. And of course, Pantera kind of kept it alive, very much kept it alive in the public consciousness. Pantera, absolutely gigantic band, very heavy, keeping it going through the 90s. Of course, we had a ton of underground stuff too. Some black metal bands rose to prominence in the 90s. You had like Mayhem, of course. It's one of the big, and Emperor. And then, of course, you had, some of the more famous commercial ones like Cradle of Filth and shit, what's the other one? Dimmy Border, I think, got their start in the 90s as well. And of course, you had the Gothenburg sound. You had In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, At the Gates. All very, very important bands. Sepultura, even though they started in the 80s, they did have a pretty good measure of success in the 90s. That's kind of when Sepultura's commercial success peak. So in the 90s, you had a ton of stuff going on. Of course, underground, you had a ton of stuff. Fear Factory and Machine Head were very important to carrying on, to the evolution of American heavy metal in the 90s. Very important. Corrosion of Conformity played a large role in that as well, I think. Just a lot of stuff was still going on in the metal world. It was, even though, and back then it was funny because in the mainstream press, and keep in mind this is right before the internet exploded, so you got to think back to this time. It wasn't quite like it is now. The internet existed, but it was not an everyday thing. Not everybody had it, and right before the internet really took off in mainstream music magazines, there would be articles written like, "Is heavy metal dead? Is heavy metal dying? Is it this? Is it that?" It was total fucking shit, but it was there every day, or seemingly every issue of any sort of music magazine would ask that. Like guitar magazines or rock magazines or whatever, they would say, "Oh, metal's dying, metal's dead." Obviously, I think we know what happened there. So through the '90s, it did carry on just fine, and then in the 2000s, by the time the 2000s rolled around, nobody was saying is heavy. Nobody was questioning it by the 2000s. Uh, you know, Metal was definitely doing well again in the 2000s, and I think largely a lot of that can be attributed to the internet. The internet has made a lot of things popular that never were. I don't think really metal's particularly popular, but it certainly proved that it's nice and healthy. Um, let's see. And in the 2000s, we had, just bear with me, guys. I gotta just read up here on some of the biggest bands of the 2000s. The 2000s. Now, I know these two bands I'm about to name, I know they got their start in the 90s, but they definitely rose to prominence in the 2000s. Tool and Korn. Okay, I know they got their start in the 90s, but come on, they had an absolutely huge time in the 2000s. Let's see who else we got. Slipknot, of course. Again, I know they technically started in the 90s. System of a Down, Lamb of God, and Disturbed. Those bands, absolutely huge in the 2000s. No way that they're not, big. So metal, and of course, there's tons and tons of other stuff that wasn't nearly as mainstream that was out there floating around. So the 2000s, absolutely no problem for metal, really whatsoever. Um, so we'll go on and we'll talk about really the current age, the 2010s, the decade we're in now. And we still got bands that have, risen to prominence this decade. Mastodon springs to mind. Pallbearer is another one. Baroness, um, Gojira, and a number of other ones. And, you know, now those may not be household names to everyone, but they're certainly well known to anybody who's a metal fan. Like, even if you're just somewhat of a metal fan, you probably know about those bands, more than likely. Whereas that's the main difference, I think, between the health of metal versus rock. In my rock video, I named off a whole bunch of current great rock bands, and I had no idea who really any of them were. Well, I mean, I've known one or two, but I didn't know the vast majority of it. And I do consider myself absolutely, I am a rock music fan. I don't only like metal. Yes, metal's my favorite, but I also do like rock, rock and roll quite a bit. I do like it. And for me not to know those bands is, kind of, yeah. I think the reason metal is healthier is mostly because I think with metal you have a bit more dedicated and crazy fans, and by that I mean once you're really into metal and you decide that it's your music, for lack of a better term, the thing that you really like, you tend to become somewhat obsessed with it. I think that's a little more common with metal fans than general rock fans, and you probably put a bit more effort to really stay up with the scene and keep up with it than a regular rock fan, because many rock fans will like the music that is popular when they're teenagers to young adults, right? They'll discover music when they're somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. They'll like that music, and then they'll continue to like new bands until they're in their early 20s, and then when anything that comes out after that, they're going to start saying things like, "Oh, music isn't as good as it used to be," etc. The old man kind of arguments that you hear. Now, this is not true for everyone. I know that there are definitely rock music fans who keep an open mind throughout their lives. I think Chris over at Dixieland Farms is a great example of a person who is, roughly my age and very open minded about new music, I think, because when he responded to my rock video, and he knows pretty much who all those bands were, so he's obviously keeping up with it, So thumbs up to you, Chris. Anyway, you know, and the other reason I think metal is healthier, and I'm putting this in air quotes, is because it was never as it's not in the public eye as much as quote regular rock. It's never really it's certainly influenced rock and roll a lot, but it's never really driven the bus, as it were, as far as popular music. Maybe for like a very brief time in the 80s, it was driving the bus, but for the most part, heavy metal has never really been the driving force behind all of popular music. And rock and roll was for decades, from like the 60s really until I'd say very recently. I'd say it probably stopped, 2005, 2006. So for a span of 40 some years, rock and roll was really driving the bus as far as popular music goes, and it's just recently it's just not. It's gone into somewhat of a dormant state. Whereas metal never ever really drove the bus. So I think the changes that have happened in the music world hasn't impacted metal as much. It's impacted it a whole lot, yes, but I don't think it's transformed it as much because, like I said, I think you have the more loyal fans. It was never as big of a genre in the first place. Blah, the internet, blah 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 blah. Right. So basically, that's where metal is now. Where do I think it's going to go in the future? Well, honestly, I think in the future we're going to see kind of more of the same. I think we're going to, and by that I mean I think we're going to continue to see new bands that kind of push the envelope of metal and think of new ways to kind of drive it forward or to do new things with it. I don't think that's going to stop. And I think as far as the popularity of metal goes, I think it's going to probably stay roughly where it is. It's actually been, as far as popularity goes, it's been very stable for about the past 15 years. It's been about the same, really, since about 2000. The overall popularity of metal has been pretty consistent since about the year 2000. It's not super high, but certainly much better than it was, in the 90s, right? I mean, 90s was the low point, and since 2000, it seems to have found a nice kind of nice and steady level of popularity. It's not shooting to the top, but it's not dropping down into nothing either. So, and like I said, I think metal's going to continue on just as healthy as ever for the foreseeable future. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. Who knows? Anyway, I'm really be interested to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you did like what you see, please thumbs up, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.